Welcome to Earth, a Love Story. I'm your host, Robin Lassiter. Today I speak with Mark Burchick, a filmmaker and artist from Baltimore, Maryland, who is exploring anomalous studies topics in his artwork and research. He most recently presented a paper, co-written with Diana Walsh Pasulka, about using AI art programs to visualize encounter experiences with angelic beings from the Catholic tradition. He also wrote a recent episode of Kelly Chase's UFO Rabbit Hole podcast discussing the black world of government secrecy and the work of artist and researcher Trevor Paglen. Mark and I discuss his childhood, which was shaped by intense fear of alien abduction, his strong desire for devotion and connection to God, as well as his certainty that due to world events and online religious prophecy, he wouldn't live to see his adult years. We talk about his work around Marian apparitions, AI, and rose petals as acheiropoieta, or religious objects not made by human hands. We have a wide-ranging conversation and could have continued for another couple of hours, I'm certain. We even take a little detour into Gnosticism at my insistence, and Mark shares an experience of sending himself a message from the future. This is a good one, folks. And Mark will be back on the podcast to dive even more deeply into these subjects. In the meantime, please check the show notes on this one to see his acheiropoieta rose petals and to watch a video highlighting his work on how AI art visualizes the religious sacred and what hand is doing the creation. And now, please enjoy this conversation with Mark Burchick. Well, how are you feeling about this, about telling your story?
Yeah, no, it's funny. I mean, you asked me a couple months ago at this point. It was probably back in November, December, and I've been hemming and hawing over it for a long time. I think part of that comes from I have public and private aspects to what I consider as my research, where, the public stuff is I work with a committee as I'm developing my thesis, and there's things I'm very comfortable discussing and working with them. But then, not to use the pejorative term, but when we talk about woo aspects of the phenomenon and all these sorts of things, I think I still have this hesitancy and this association with stigma that's just so baked into my brain from years and years and years of telling people that it's not okay to talk about these things, that I have this whole other research angle that's part of my work regarding anomalous phenomenon that I'm still, for whatever reason, hesitant to share. And I think I'm tired of that now. And I think that's part of wanting to really just embrace the fact that hey, this is an important part of me. It's been important part of my life. It's an important part of what informs my work. And yeah, I wanna tell that story.
Yeah, that is you're reminding me of what I felt, when I was thinking about writing my book and telling my story. And this is ridiculous, but I thought, people are going to come to my door. People are going to show up. They'll bring the torches and the pitchforks and be like, you can't. Also, my life was a hot mess for a long time. And so people hearing the way that I narrated the story, that may not have been their perception at all. I had a lot of fears with all of it. And also, I will say that coming out of this, of the experiencer closet, was the softest landing that I've ever had. It was just people saying oh, good. You said it. Now, can I tell you the thing? And I'm yes, tell me.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was really fortunate to be able to go to the first Archives of the Impossible conference. And so as part of my MFA studies, there's graduate school money that's guaranteed to me. I just have to make a case for it. So, but that stuff gets signed off on by my deans. So I had to essentially write abstracts describing to the deans of my college, why I wanted to go to this event. And I was okay, how do I articulate this? I mean, this is a very prestigious university, and clearly this is steeped in academia and comes from this place where, especially within the study of religious history, they're trying to give space to what's very clearly a space to ground anomalous phenomenon. So I was great, this shouldn't be very hard, but I still had this association of stigma with it. And that's why I'm really glad that Archives of the Impossible exists, the great work that Jeff Kripal and Diana Pasulka are doing. And then our friends with J. Christopher King, the Experiencer Group, the anomalous phenomenon conferences that they're doing up in New York. I think that's just all part of this like amazing work to help center this material in a way that is more palatable to not just the general public, but academia as well. And so I'm trying to find myself in that mold and be more comfortable entering that space. And yeah, like I said, coming on this podcast is like definitely part of that.
Mm. I love that. And as you were talking, I was reminded how the stakes are very low for me. Like I'm a weird artist who lives in the middle of nowhere. And, I don't have academia. I don't have to like justify it to anybody. I can just say weird things and nobody is it doesn't really affect a whole lot. So
Mhm.
it's courageous to approach that threshold and want to get involved with this. And also, I imagine there's not ever been an easier time to do it in many ways because of, Jeff Kripal and the Archives of the Impossible. And I went to the second of those conferences, and I gotta say, if college was like that, I would have stayed. I wouldn't have like run off and become I don't know, lived in a commune and done all the wild things that I did. I'd have been like, oh, I can get behind this. This is really interesting. So it's an amazing thing that he's doing. The archives themselves are amazing.
I definitely recognize too that I'm very fortunate that the arts of everything is probably the most like accepting space to also be upfront about your weird experiences, because it's like, yeah, artists have been, I mean, this is what art is birthed out of, is these types of experiences and wanting to visualize the ineffable and visualize the sacred. So, I mean, it's way easier for me to have these kinds of conversations in a committee room with four other artists as opposed to trying to justify this to like, STEM folk. And yeah, I think there's a lot of good humor in that too, where, sometimes I'm hesitant to talk about stuff with my committee and then they're like, oh yeah, I mean, like I saw a ghost the other day, like, those types of stories and experiences, especially when we get together. So yeah, I don't know why I do all this hem and hawing, but it really comes down to like me still overcoming what is perceived as some sort of stigma that really doesn't exist. And I think part of having these types of conversations is really just to help share with other people that, hey, this is all okay. There's no need to get stuck in your head about it. But with that said, I also recognize I'm a huge fan of the podcast. I've gone back and
Mm.
listened to all your episodes. I really think that your book is one of the great like spiritual and nature biographies
Mm.
of what I hope will become a classic for the experiencer literature moving forward. And I say that as somebody who's like spiritual biography is like one of my favorite genres, especially within my Catholic context. I know that you're coming back from retreat this week, so I'm kind of curious to hear where you're at. What are you carrying? Are you still in that buzz coming back from retreat? Are you kind of easing back into reality, so to speak?
Yeah, thank you. I did get back from retreat. I am settling back in. It was also a pretty soft landing. And it was the longest retreat that I've done. And it was, much of it was silent. Yeah. One of the biggest things I took back was that I'm really, really tired of spending all my time looking at my phone. And I didn't turn it on for like a week. I didn't turn it on, which to me, that's like a miraculous thing, to go all of that time and not engage with my phone and not have music or not have a podcast. I did have a book that I resorted to when I was deeply and dramatically suffering. I got sick and I was, there's a lot of empty time in retreat. And I was just kind of suffering with it and I wanted a distraction. So I did pick it up, but it was a very informative book. So that was okay. But yeah, honestly, I feel like everything has changed after the retreat, which often happens with me. If I just take like any time at all to turn away from my habitual practices and distractions and really deepen into something, I feel like the whole world just kind of blossoms and flowers open. And I have this rich experience of life. And I think, why am I not living like this all the time? And maybe it's not possible. Maybe we have to kind of come in and out in order to stabilize in deeper and deeper realms. But that's kind of how I feel now, is like, ooh, the world is very alive and magical and present. And I'm working really hard not to slip back into the the mindless scrolling, that I am very prone to do. So
A lot of that comes from a place too of being envious of having that time to be able to do that. My wife and I have a 1 year old. She just
mhm.
turned one, and the idea we talk about like, oh man, how great would it be to do like a retreat weekend to be able to answer the emails that are backlogged on. That we're in that kind of headspace right now,
Yeah.
and it was really funny because the last project that the two of us worked on together was about a community of Trappist monks,
Mm.
Catholic monks that are cloistered. They're part of like the Benedictine lineage, and so they don't leave their monastery. It's exactly what you picture in your mind's eye. But this community brews beer, and we were very fortunate to be given access and to be behind the cloister and film with them for a couple weeks. And that was our last project prior to having our child. And so both of us had this sort of like spiritual resurgence of like, man, we really look forward to having the opportunity to go on retreat, maybe back with that community or communities closer to us, because so many of them offer those types of opportunities. And it's just not going to happen anytime soon. So
Right.
we're, yeah, really, really envious.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. A 1 year old little girl. Is that right? She's a girl. Yeah, I think I've seen. So I'll tell a little tiny backstory is just that how I find guests for the podcast is often through what I just, vilified, which is scrolling on Instagram. But that's how I found you. And I saw that you were doing these images on rose petals, which I want to get into and we'll talk about it. And it just struck me. And I was like, oh my God, I have to talk to this guy. What the hell is this? Sorry, I cuss a lot. I don't want to offend you, but I do.
No, no, no,
Um,
absolutely.
okay. Yeah. So then I looked, so then you kind of got on my radar and I've seen that this beautiful family that you have and this
Well,
really
thank you.
interesting work that you do. And so I'm very curious, also with Diana's book coming out, which I got and it's just hasn't come to the top of my pile yet. I haven't read, but I know that it's really deeply talks about Catholicism and religious studies. And so I really do want to hear your journey, how you came in. I think the idea that that there is fear of kind of coming out about these things, even though intellectually it's like, okay, if you dig deep enough, everybody has a story and there's, academia is kind of accepting this. This is a place to do all of that. There is still a fear and there is a stigma. And that's to me more interesting than like whether it's real or true or not. It is there. Where does it come from? And what kind of deconditioning do we have to do? So I'm very interested in like your childhood story, if you want to dive into it.
Okay, so let me first say, let me center like where I'm at like religiously in my life. I call myself Catholic, but that's like Catholicism to me is like the same thing as saying like, oh, I'm a voting American. You're either kind of leaning one spectrum or another on maybe a liberal or conservative spectrum, but then there's a million other voices within that. And so, but at the end of the day, you're still an American. The Catholic Church is very much the same.
Mm.
There's wildly different perspectives of people who proudly call themselves Catholics, but then have wildly different opinions. So I'm very comfortable calling myself Catholic, but I'm definitely, I mean, with anomalous studies here, you're going to get a wide range of interesting spectrum. With that said, too, I think I lean philosophically Buddhist, and I think I proudly claim some of that lineage too. Yeah, I mean my beliefs and opinions are all over the place. So there's a lot that I'm like upset with the Catholic Church about. I would not say that I'm like actively practicing in the sense that I go to church every week, but like there's definitely periods where I'm like, oh my God, I need to be part of the ritual and the art and being in the space and smelling the incense and all the things that you may not get in more Protestant American church. So there's a million things that I crave and love about the Catholic tradition. And really, it comes down to the alternative voices within the Catholic Church that are the ones that are not as mainstream. That's not part of what my childhood was growing up. I'm definitely part of a big Catholic family, and we would, for example, like at dinner every night, we would pray over the meal and then say, okay, so one of the boys has to pick out what saint is going to bless the meal tonight. And that I was just part of like learning who these people were. And I mean, sometimes you would just throw out a name like George and be like, I'm sure that there's a Saint George. And then we'd have to go look it up and like figure out what this person's story is. But yeah, I think growing up Catholic in America post 9/11. So I was 9 when 9/11 happened. And I grew up in this context where if I had questions about anything related to Christianity, I would just go to the internet and just, type in Google and say like, is X a sin? And of course, the way the internet is designed is you're going to get the most extreme voices of anything, right? So I grew up with a very different context, making assumptions about what Catholicism was or Christianity in general was, largely informed by the internet. I say that to say, within that post 9/11 context, being a young kid, I grew up with a lot of anxiety about the world. And I can take a step back here too and say from a very young age, I was fascinated with anomalous studies. I looked at UFO books all the time. My school had a pretty big paranormal library. And so, I'd be flipping through like spiritualist photography and Fae literature. And I was just like utterly consumed with that stuff. And for the longest period of my life, and I cannot justify or explain why this is outside of just consuming it all the time, alien abduction was my greatest fear. And I have no justification for that beyond, like I said, just reading it. But it got so bad to the point where I was like, I would not sleep months on end, to the point where like I would be crawling into my parents' bed at 3 a.m. And my mom eventually had enough of it and told my dad like, hey, you need to talk to him and figure out what's going on here. And so I remember distinctly my dad having this sit down conversation with me and being like, hey, like, what's going on here? And I'd be like, I think that aliens are going to abduct me every night. And he's like, well, okay, so personally, I believe in aliens too. And I do believe that this abduction phenomenon probably does happen. But hey, we don't have actually any evidence to think that we've been abducted. And so there's nothing to worry about. And I was like, okay, I got the message that my parents don't want me to like talk about this anymore. But there wasn't also this reassurance, like there wasn't this reassurance from my parents that like, my dad we regularly have conversations about this stuff now. And anytime we get together as a family, we just have really fun conversations. So, we definitely give space within our family's religious language to talk about this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
With the history of the Catholic Church, you have saints who intercede in the lives of people praying. So we clearly have this belief in, essentially ghosts that are interacting with people on a daily basis. And I think with the stories of miracles and, these great lives lived, it gives a lot of space for the anomalous to be real. And it's a really enchanted world in that respect. And I think that's something I've really valued about this lineage. I say all this to say, when it comes into my studies and wanting to understand more about this tradition, I think that there's so much room to collaborate with experiencers, to share not just our narratives and our histories, but and to use this all just as like data. And this is some of the great work that I see coming out of the Rice conferences, is this idea that religious history and anomalous history is just human history.
I want to ask you a couple of things. So one of them, I just want to note how amazing it is that when you went to your dad and you're like, hey, this is what I'm really afraid of, that what I thought you were going to say is like, that's not real. There are no monsters under your bed and ETs are not. He's like, well, yeah, it's a thing, but pretty sure not in our lineage. Thanks, Dad.
Right.
Did that help you sleep?
No. Well,
No,
yeah, exactly. I think I definitely just responded like, okay, I'm not going to go to them anymore for this kind of solace. But what that did lead to, thank you for saying that, because that prompted me to think about this. What that did lead to was for me to subconsciously develop a really nuanced, like spiritual protection prayer. Every single night I would pray to a spirit team. I'd be like, God, my guardian angels, intercessing saints, to say, hey, can you guys watch over me and protect this house, protect my dreams? That was a fear, was like, I constantly had nightmares around. Oh, okay. So yeah, in this post 9/11 context, like I just constantly had nightmares about growing up in my family household, coming out on the back deck and watching like the sky explode, just what, like tidal waves coming towards the house, or, asteroids and meteors coming down from the skies, black helicopters, people in hazmat suits, like all this sort of stuff that I could not just like, granted, yeah, I grew up on a lot of like summer blockbusters where you see this type of imagery, but I don't have a justification for why I was having those dreams. And this is so common in the experiencer literature that this is, I don't know, you've talked about it as well. I was just at the beach this last weekend with my family, and every single one of my family members brought this up. We just got on a conversation about dreams, and every single person said, I've had that exact dream of being at our family house and seeing this stuff in the backyard. I'm like, where does that come from? Why is that part of our dream? So, point being, I was like, this was the life I was steeped in. And I was like, I'm fed up with this. This is really, I just had a lot of anxiety as a kid that I just kind of kept bottled up. And being able to lean into prayer and creating this, like, essentially prayer protection really got me through that period. And finding out later that, within like ritual magic language, you have all of these sorts of practices that people do of, like, creating astral barriers and prayers of protection that are essentially exactly what I did, creating these protocols of, if I'm going to be entering the astral, how do I set up a prayer protection spell, a banishing ritual, all these sorts of things. And I'm like, oh, I was just doing that inadvertently and had stumbled into it, but it solved a lot of those problems.
Wow, I love that. It's amazing. Yeah, that was going to be my question for you. Like, did it help? And it's amazing to hear that. Yeah, it sounds like it did help. That's like when I work with people, that's the first thing that we talk about. What is a boundary? Is it okay to set it? And it's really interesting to hear from people. Some people are really afraid that if they set a boundary, they'll piss off whatever's,
Right.
they're like, I don't want to. And so it's actually a deep conversation about agency and all of those things. So it's really amazing that you stumbled into it and, yeah, had the wherewithal at that age to develop those practices and that they helped. And yeah,
Hmm.
the apocalypse dreams. Yep. Steeped in blockbuster movies, all of that. I wasn't at that age. So where does that come from? And our family was not religious. I didn't have any of that imagery to draw from, and yet it was there. And yeah, definitely one of the hardest parts of all of this is seeing those images, having that recurring dream, and then having it be a shared dream. And I don't know, it's baked into me that something is coming because of that. And then I've had to
Right.
like back away from that and step back and be like, okay, well, they've been telling me something's coming since I was 4. So do I have to like go into a panic attack today? Like, is it coming tomorrow? Is it coming in a
Right.
year? Is it coming or is it not coming? And this is just like a developmental driver
Yeah.
that happens to kind of activate a sense of urgency, all these questions around it. And regardless at that age, really hard to deal with, like
Yeah.
really terrifying to deal with. Yeah.
Absolutely. No, and I mean, I come back to that question at least once a day. Thinking about, like, why was this baked into me? And is this just part of the collective conscious manifesting itself in us? Clearly, this is a human struggle that has been with us since the dawn of time. We always picture our own fiery demise, and we create these communities of alternative ideas to help hopefully avert that. But especially, and I mean, this is something that comes up in the Marian apparition literature within the context of the 20th century. We're responding to, like, nuclear threat narratives. And Mary explodes onto the scene specifically focused on that of, like, how can we avert these crises? And so I think for myself growing up in, again, this post 9/11 era, I was watching the Middle East explode into a lot of people discussing this as like a great religious war with the Iraq war. The full expectation that being centered so close to Israel, and we see this again right now with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's just a common hallmark that the third temple needs to be rebuilt for the second coming to happen. And so, like, really extreme Christian voices are really focused their attention on this region for all these reasons. And so that was the ethos that I was, like, seeing growing up on the internet. Then you also have, like, the 2012 Mayan calendar. So I genuinely thought that I was never going to live past the age of 18. And growing up with that anxiety, I think made me really sort of like old soul, like wiser than my years. I was just like a really weird kid, fully expecting that, like, hey, I'm never going to have a family. I'm never going to have a career. And so, like, what are the things that I can do with my life now? And as opposed to leaning into, like, partying and living for the moment. I think I was really just like, I idolize those things. And those are the things that because I won't have them, I crave. How can I show up for like, it's like middle school and high school. It's like, how can I be focused on getting a girlfriend to just like experience some
Mm,
grasp of like having love and I showing up for my family and really caring about family values and just being like a good little conservative Christian boy. I think that was a lot of that period. So point being, by the time I get to college and start to like unpack a lot of that stuff from my youth, that's where I was like, oh, I can just like throw off everything I've ever grown up on and start to have a more comparativist language for exploring outside of that upbringing. So definitely became way more liberal in my thought. I mean, and I think this is just a natural byproduct of college too, where you're getting exposed to so many different voices and religions and political views. So yeah, it was that period of deconstructing everything that I grew up with and then embracing new ways of being in the world. And so I set aside religion and anomalous studies for a really long time. And then bam, 2017 article. And it all comes screaming back into my life. So that just sort of times out with at the same time I was beginning to explore religion again, beginning this documentary with the monastery that I'd mentioned. I was also being exposed to new strains in anomalous studies with the 2017 article. So that's where I first became aware of Diana Pasulka's work and Jeff Kripal's work and was like, oh, here's an incredible literature that combines all of these interests and says, um, I think by this point, I had reached a mindset that I think I'd heard Diana reference at some point where she's like, I grew up with these stories from my youth about like the saints and mystics, but I'd relegated that to like ancient history. I just thought that this is something that happened back in the day. And these types of things don't happen anymore. And then suddenly, when I look at the experiencer literature and realize that people are having these narratives all the time, it made me go, oh, like this is happening in the here and now. And here's a community of people that are being stigmatized, who aren't allowed to share their narratives, who reflect our religious histories. And so not only is there like data here that isn't being studied, but these are people being harmed by not being able to talk about their experiences, to integrate their experiences. And frankly, when you look at the history of religious, I just heard this mirrored in your conversation with Yoni previously of these are some of the most important stories that were like pivotably important to a culture. You think of the role of the shaman within a culture. You think of the role of your mystic who shows up for the community and can provide all of this information and leadership from their particular set of skills or insights that they're being given. And it's like, we need more of that. So
mhm.
I think these last couple of years have been a reckoning for me and lead me to want to be more public about this research by saying, like, how can we combine these narratives, again, religious history and experiencer narratives, and collectively kind of get to the bottom of what our human experience is telling us.
Mm, yeah, that's right in my wheelhouse for sure. And one of the things that you mentioned early on was, yeah, it was this idea that there are religious experiences, but then what experiencers are having is something different, and we're not going to conflate the two of them. And it seems to me that there's more and more space and conversation for that to happen, where it's like, actually, if we look at these things, which is bizarre and amazing that it's not in the mainstream. It's in the mainstream as much as it is, but it's like working behind the scenes, it feels, to bring this other kind of narrative into being. And also, like, nobody really knows what an experiencer is. If you ask 10 people on the street, I mean, I don't know if any, I think you need a bigger sample maybe to find out, so it's interesting that it's this very small conversation, and that these really potent things are happening. And to me, feels like it's happening really quickly, because I didn't know ufology existed until 2019. I didn't know that it existed. I didn't know there were books written. I never heard of an experiencer. I didn't have any language for it. And so all of that became the context and the language that I made sense of my life through. And I'm also, this is such a rabbit hole, but human design, the area of human design, which is this whole system that includes like astrology and the I Ching was downloaded to this guy over 8 days and nights by a voice. So it's what we're talking about. This guy was sort of given this teaching. Then he spent the rest of his life going around the world and teaching about what it is. But in that system, I'm part of my design is the heretic. So as soon as anything becomes like solid and accepted, I'm moving on. I'm like,
Right.
okay, are we going to make experiencer the thing? So
Right.
the fact to me, the fact that it's moving as quickly as it is, it's like we barely know what an experiencer is or means. We have this framework where there's this collection of experiences, and already we're crossing genres. We're like going into religion, we're going into the fae, like all of these things are coming and all playing in the same realm. And that is my favorite thing ever. Like that there's room for all of it and that it's being seen that way, even if just in our little like niche culture that is emerging here. I do want to, let's see, I had something that I wanted to ask you about specifically. Oh, yeah. So when you were a kid, had all this anxiety going into college and being like, oh, getting a broader view of the world. Was that conscious? Were you like, okay, I can discard this and now pick up these broader views? Or was it now looking back, you can see that happened?
I think a little bit was responding to the frustration of being like, I lived my life in so much fear and anxiety and nothing happened. I'm still
Mm,
here. Life is great. I'm happy. Why did I ever live in that fear? And
mm,
then just living, I think this came much later. I mean, obviously there's a deconstruction period and that comes with its own heartaches and hurdles. But getting to this point where, oh, I'm ready to accept joy as my mantra. And I mean, that's why I've been responding so lovingly to your recent episodes is like the idea of like evolution through joy is really important to me now. It has been important in recent years. And I think moving forward, I want to set these intentions surrounding like, I think I had such a happy childhood. And I'm not naive in thinking that like much of my view of the good that religion does in this world is because I had a really great childhood. I also have everyone who's married into my family, no one's Catholic. So I have four brothers, now have four sister-in-laws. None of them are Catholic. And, that might have been a point of contention for some older folk in the family, as you can imagine. But point being, almost every single one of them has some horror story of something insane a Catholic did or said to them. Stories like my grandfather was dying in a hospital, and the priest on site said, if he didn't get last rites, he's going to hell.
mm.
Like, how fucking dare you? Um,
Do you remember that? Do you remember my family's experience with that? I'm not sure if you caught it in the book, but
yeah, no,
yeah.
please remind me.
Yeah, I mean, just almost the same, except for it was after my grandfather had died. The local wasn't Catholic, I think it was Baptist, but like the local preacher was like, he was a great guy, took care of his family, worked hard. Unfortunately, like didn't go to church, wasn't saved, so he's going to hell. Like at
Yeah.
the funeral.
Yeah.
And that
Just
was
like,
one of the things that my dad was like, that's why we weren't religious. He was just like, this is the most ridiculous thing. So anyway,
yeah.
that's a very amazing like similarity to have happen in your family. It's wild.
No, I mean, I know so many people that have that exact same story. And it's just like, why? Why? It's like this most inhuman, deserving of hell thing to tell somebody. And and at the end of the day, too, it's like, you don't fucking know. Like the narrative that you tell yourself does not give you permission to war that over somebody else. And I personally experienced that too. I was at a Christian conference in my teens where I saw not even a priest. It was just like somebody who was like strong evangelical Christian was giving this talk, and this woman walks up to him in tears after the talk and was like, my son is in his 20s. He lives with his girlfriend. I'm sure they're having premarital sex. Is there anything I can do for them? And he's like, nope, straight to hell. And it's just like, just like it was a glass shattering moment of like,
Mm.
one, how dare you? And then two, like, you don't effing know, like, guy. And you have ruined this woman's life. You're probably going to ruin a perfectly healthy relationship. You give this son and this person that he's seeing a utter fear whether or not mom suddenly comes to them and is like, hey, you have to break up with this girl, or you have to move home, or you guys have to stop having sex. Well, like, stop, like get out of people's bedrooms. So, long story short, that there was a lot of that, of like glass shattering moments of being like, oh, this is deeply unhealthy. And I can clearly see, like, I didn't have a lot of that in my childhood growing up. And so I just had this wonderful relationship with God and just this utter faith and hope and trust that the world is an inherently good place. And then seeing how religion has played a role in other people's lives and being like, oh, this is what, like, I get it now. And this is what we're up against. And frankly, for me, it just comes down to like bad theology. It's people who have their own agendas and who want to tell people how people are supposed to live their lives. And ultimately, it's like religion for me is a school of how to teach people how to love better. We don't really have that. Our educational system is not really designed to provide people that. Maybe philosophy is like the other realm you get closest to teaching people how to be and how to love better. But for me, I mean, I personally believe that Buddhism is probably the best school of how to teach people how to love. But then the core message of Christianity in the Jesus narrative is love your neighbor, get over yourself, love your enemies. I'm like, that's what I'm showing up here for, and that's what I want to preach. And forget everything else. Like that's what the core message is, and everything else you can throw out the door. And so, and when I say that too, that's why this has become an important part of my lineage, is this aspect that there are so many alternative voices that don't get enough attention within Christianity that are preaching that exact same message, quietly living a gospel life that no one ever hears about. And it's it's like I don't go to church, but I show up to podcasts and reading about this lineage and seeing the people who've led quiet, beautiful lives that teach me how to be a better person in this world and to love other people better. I'm like, okay, that's why I do what I do. And that's what I would hope to preach. But like, I'm also not here trying to like convert people. That's not my job.
Yeah. It's very interesting. I have a parallel, which I'm sure that you've heard me talk about, and I'm sick of myself saying it, but I can't help it. It's such an important part of my story that I had similar experience of having these deep questions and going to Google, or going to Facebook and getting like channeled material from Archangel Michael, or, all of this wild stuff that was very, very new age, and feeling like I'd really found something, and then having to go through the process of deconditioning from that at some point. And I threw everything out, and the world became very dead. I can't believe any of this because it was so damaging. And so I threw it all away, but going through the process of deconstruction, like deconstructing all of those ideas and dogmas and systems that were like installed in us in whatever way. I think it's probably deeply part of being human, or at least modern humans, is that we kind of get some programming and then have to deconstruct from it. But going through that deconstruction process and then finding my way back to something that unless somebody listens to the nuance of the conversation, just like what you're talking about, it kind of feels like you end up back at the same place where you started, but there's so much more depth, like maturity, nuance, paradox, discernment, all of those things that weren't there the first time. I still find that journey really edgy. It's like, if anybody really asks me like how I believe this stuff, I have to tell them that. I have to be like, okay, but wait, it's not like I'm just, buying this hook, line, and sinker, and not, and it's not run through some sort of discernment. And also, it's so hard. It's like we have to unweave it and then weave it back together, and it's a really difficult journey. So, yeah, a lot of resonance there with that.
Yeah, I mean, to respond to that, I'd say like the internet is not a good place to get information.
Right.
And it's like, but that's how we do it today, and that's also how we find community. And when those are our best great options, but this system is designed to probably radicalize us inadvertently. It was, that's not, no one thinks that they're going to get on the internet one day and get radicalized. We wouldn't go to it if we knew that was the case. But like the system was designed inadvertently to do that. And so, I value community as a way of solving some of these questions that people have. It's like, how else can you experience something and then hold on to it by yourself? You have to do this in community to integrate the experience. But we need to find different and better ways of showing up. And that's why I just love the experiencer group's ethos is like everything's on the table, no judgment. We're going to figure this out together and provide space for each other. And hopefully, like you would hope that religion can do that too. But I think that um, for me, it's been really important within that deconstruction period is to, and I think Jeff Kripal says this, it's like you got to explore and lose two great traditions before you can become a good comparativist. And, I love that because it's like, you're like, okay, that clearly didn't work for me. So now I'm going to go full bore into this other thing. And when you see that that thing didn't work, you can then step back and be like, take everything seriously, hold it loosely. I think I got that language from you actually, which I'm so appreciative for because, that's what I try to respond to all of this with is I think the way I respond to that is I do a lot of auditioning. I'm at a place in my life now where I'm like, what would it be like to live for 6 months as just a super hardcore Gnostic? Like actually trying to just believe like, okay, are there archons that guide my life? What practices can I do to break out of the matrix? And then 6 months later, I'm like, okay, cool. Here's what I got from that experience. I can completely unpack all of that and be like, wow, that was crazy. Didn't enjoy that. Or be like, oh, I got a lot of really good, helpful, conducive things that will help me into the next step of my life. So I think that's kind of where I'm at. It's just like holding everything on the table, being willing to say like, what can be gained from this, what maybe isn't as helpful. And I think that's just the good work of a comparativist. And, that's kind of where I've landed.
It's amazing. Yeah, I really love that. And it takes a certain amount. I mean, it takes I don't know, pretty good amount of, again, like discernment and maturity to be able to do that because these things are very compelling. Like Gnosticism, that is a rabbit hole that I am afraid to go down because
Yeah,
I
yeah.
am, yeah, like you give me a charismatic speaker and a good story. I'm like, I'm in, let's do the thing. So I could feel with Gnosticism when I started looking into it, like you can feel the pull, like the draw of that narrative. And I'm not even saying it's not true, I don't know.
Yeah,
Uh
exactly.
like it's reflecting something and it has, and again, you're doing comparative, exploration. And so you see, I'm sure all the overlaps. I would love if you wouldn't mind like to land on Gnosticism for a second, talk about it, partly
Sure.
because number one, because I'm afraid of it in like just a way that I know that I could, especially like if I had found it 10 years ago, my life would have been completely different because I would have been
Sure.
like, yes, the archons, we have to, whatever. And also because those ideas are making their way through our country right now in a really, really big way and informing a lot of people. And it doesn't not make sense. Like, I get it. I'm not somebody who thinks that half the country is just stupid. I'm like, I don't think that that's what's going on. I think that there are these ideas that take hold and they're very, very compelling. So it's pretty amazing that you're like, I'm going to dip into this for 6 months and go at it and just see what I get out of it and then be able to retreat back out. So anything that I have so many questions. I really want to talk about like all these aspects of your work, but you like stopped me at Gnosticism. So we're going to have to dive in there a
No,
little
totally.
bit.
I'm here for it. And I mean, it's just amazing to be able to have these kinds of conversations. Okay. So yeah, I'd say about 2, 3 years ago is when I started like really wanting to explore that. And part of that just comes with that unpacking of religious history. And you're like, okay, here's a whole corpus of, there's a whole library of information that was sitting in the desert, untouched, that was clearly important to a huge group of people for a very long time and was purposely hidden. What does that have to say about the way we understand this early religious period and why did we end up with the narratives that we did? So like here, like seeing what actually exists within Nag Hammadi, and I've not had the time to really do a deep dive to, and I really look forward to it in the future. But yeah, it's that idea that everything we think we know about our religious histories, we have to throw out because there was clearly this incredibly important information that existed, which is now relegated to history. And we get to re-explore that now through these sorts of archaeological discoveries. That's really exciting. And the type of information that emerges, and then larger Gnostic ethos that isn't just unique to Christianity. This is themes that run throughout all of human history, come down to the individual experiencer has an experience. They have divine revelation that then inspires them to have a completely changed life. And so much of it being this, none of this is important. This is all a stage. This is all a show for the actual thing. When you place that information alongside like the reincarnation literature, and I mean, we're now very clearly seeing that there's like really good studies showing that like, hey, this might be an actual phenomenon, and there's something to be said for the near-death experience literature and reincarnation literature, points to a radically different perspective of what the afterlife can look like. That was incredibly important to people in the past, and we've just sort of set it aside for a very long time. It's like, hey, I'm here for it. Like, this is important. We need to be paying more attention to this, and we need to be doing this in dialogue with all peoples of faith. Because again, this is not relegated to any religious context. This is human history, and there's something here. So I think you see that. I don't want to take all of Gnostic literature, and I'm highly skeptical of archons. I think that's like a quick, easy way to say we can assign, shadow government, deep state stuff, whatever you want to say. I think that all falls into some sketchy conspiracy territory that's all part of the popular discourse right now. But it's not unimportant. I'm not uninterested in archons. I think that's like something that should be part of the conversation. But it's again, take it seriously, hold it loosely. There's people in my life that it's very much coming to have a conversation about some of this stuff because they have such passionate beliefs stemming from internet discourse. And I agree with you. Like, there's a reason that this information is such like a flashpoint in the culture right now, and I want to respond to it by saying there's a lot. Again, going back to your evolution through suffering, evolution through joy mantra. If you choose to believe that worldview, it can get dark really quickly. And instead, we can make the choice to say, hey, there's other ways of being in the world. If that's happening one way or another, you really don't have any control over it. And that's really ultimately what the Gnostics are saying. It's like, hey, there's other ways of being in the world. Let's stop like paying so much attention on this. Let's not take things as seriously as we think we may need to, and instead show up for each other in ways that get us to the next thing collectively. And like, that's what I'm here for.
Wow. Thank you so much for all of that. That's amazing. I love it. This is the best. I love these conversations, being able to go down these rabbit holes. Like I just jotted down some notes of things I wanted to talk to you about. And one of them is your experience, right? Like your kind of experience that the way that I would frame it is that it induced ontological shock and also took a really long time to integrate and caused you to have some worldview changes. Yeah, we have a lot to dig into there.
Cool. Yeah. So there's two that definitely come to mind. And the first was, I actually don't know the time period. This was probably like 14, 15, 16, somewhere in that time frame. So on the splitting edge of like kind of my deconstruction period. And so, I mean, you have to think of the context of like, okay, young boy in his teens is going to a big Catholic conference where, you listen to a bunch of speakers, there's like priests and nuns and monks everywhere. And you're there with a group of friends who are all like your buddies from school, all like-minded. You're maybe getting into drinking on weekends for the first time, talking about girls, et cetera, et cetera. And so, long story short, I'm in this gymnasium. This is like the final night of the conference where they had this massive gymnasium. There's probably like 1,000 people. And there's this catwalk that surrounds the arena. And they placed these Benedictine monks up there that were singing Gregorian chant, and just incredibly powerful. You can picture the acoustics of the space is just reverberating everywhere, heavily incensed. And then they told the crowd that they had a piece of the true cross that was going to be like carried through in like a monstrance. And I don't think they were doing a mass. I think it was literally just like, we're going to be here in adoration of this relic that we believe is present. And I even in my mind's eye, I'm thinking with some degree of skepticism, like, okay, this is clearly not an actual piece of the cross. Like, that cannot be true. Why is that in rural Maryland? But point being, it was the first time hearing like live Gregorian chant. And I just remember being so incredibly moved. And this is the context of like wanting to be a devout person, like wanting to show up in my life for God and whatever God's mission for me may be. And so I'm kneeling, really hard gym floor, you know, your knees hurt, just quietly praying. But it was the first time I would say I've been being able to get into a really good meditative space. I probably meditated before, but like nothing like this, and especially given the context and the environment of the space. And spontaneously, I can feel this welling up inside of me of, and again, there's no language to describe it, but it feels like golden light being poured into your body. Like you are a vessel that is filling up. And it was warm, it was energetic, and it starts subtle at first and then starts getting like really powerful. And, you know, I don't think this was not the case, but it feels as, you know, my eyes are closed and it feels as if you're in a spotlight and you can feel the warmth of the spotlight. You know, that feeling of being on a stage and feeling a hot light behind you. It's exactly like that. And so I open my eyes and there's no sensation of light, but it's still there in your mind's eye. And it felt like being lifted up. So I'm like, I look down to confirm that like I'm still on the hardwood floor and I am, but you're feeling the sensation. And quickly, I mean, it's like, when I look at other people's literature, I think like I compare this experience now to Jeff Kripal's Kali experience, where he talks about like it was being like plugged into a wall socket, like you feel like you're being electrified. I would not say it was not that energetic, but it was definitely like parts of my body that I'd never experienced before. Of like, I don't know what is happening to me. This is very bizarre. But then the closest thing I can compare it to is sexual gratification. It felt like a full body orgasm, and but it was so much more than that. It was beyond that. And I don't have the language to describe that otherwise. So as this is happening, I'm then suddenly in panic mode because I'm like, this is a bad feeling. I've only ever been told that like sexual gratification is especially for young boy outside the context of a marriage, you know, and masturbation is a sin. So like I'm like, what do I do with this? Like, this is incredible. And I do believe that this is coming from God, but it feels the only language that I have to compare it to is the orgasm. And so once it started to get to that point, I would say at the time when I started having those thoughts, it just clicked off like a light switch. And I was like, oh, that was God being mad at me because I compared this wonderful thing that was happening to an orgasm. And it was like, you know, bad boy, like stop. And you know, what do you do with that experience? So for the longest time, I was like, I lived in just utter shame because I was like, God was mad at me for comparing this like wonderful, beautiful communion experience that was going to happen to some sort of like sexual experience. And it's only been in recent years of like hearing Jeff Kripal's experience and unpacking this history of like ecstatic experiences with saints and mystics and their hearing their stories of ecstatic experiences being so sexually coded, but like not being willing to take that extra step, that I've begun to understand like, oh, this was not like God shutting this down. I shut this down. Like my guilt, shame complex that was given to me by my Catholicism is what caused me to shut this experience down. And I don't know what would have happened had I carried through with it, if I had allowed it to happen. But like, I now understand that this is the language of like a Kundalini awakening, or this shows up in so much other literature of like the jhanas and the siddhis of like Hindu and Buddhist literature, that this is just again, another universal human experience. These things happen at stoplights. These things happen spontaneously in dreams. These things happen in sex. And I don't know what this is, but this is a human experience. It doesn't even necessarily have to be religiously understood or coded, but there's something very clear about the meditative experience or the spiritual experience in which these things also happen. And Catholicism, I think, is frankly a bad way of getting to it because our sexual hangups and sexual stigmas that the church has placed on people completely prevent and hide this language. So this is one of my, I mean, I fully adopt this from Jeff Kripal's research, but I'm really, really fascinated with the art history depictions of ecstatic experiences of saints being sexually coded. you look at that history and you're like, clearly these people are having like orgasms when they're in whatever, like, they're being stabbed by an angel or Saint Francis being blasted by the seraphim. But there's some sort of weird sexual component going on. And that's the closest language we have to talk about whatever this communion experience is. And we just have so many hangups that don't allow us to be frank and speak about the way this stuff needs to be. And I think that's one of the major problems with Catholicism. You look at Hinduism and they're like, the language of Tantra and the language of like, there's so many other traditions that allow us to talk about sex and divinity as being interlinked somehow. And Catholicism just doesn't do a great job of it. And that's been a huge period of deconstruction, reevaluating that experience happening to me and thinking of it in this way that it's like, again, this was me shutting this down. This wasn't God's shame with me, and having to unpack that and realize like, oh, if I wanted this to happen now, how could I cultivate it? I do occasionally when I have time, I'll like do like hemisync meditation or really now I spend, especially during COVID, I spend a lot of time doing Buddhist like loving kindness meditation. And that's really where I find my practice. And I can very quickly cultivate that feeling again. It feels like holding something back in a dam at times. And just like reading some of the Kundalini literature, I'm like, I don't think I'm ready for this, even still today. And especially I also place that within the context of like, I have a young child at home. I'm very busy in my career right now. It would be a bad time to have the types of like breaks that you hear associated with like the Kundalini awakening. So I'm like, I feel very comfortable at this point in my life being like, this is something that is present in my life. And I'm just going to hold off until the future where there's like a better time to explore some of this.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Right. And the awareness that it's not something to be cavalier about. And you had that experience and knew that, yeah, this is so powerful. It's not something to just be like, yeah, let's see what happens. Is it going to blow my life apart? Which it completely can. And I was very appreciative of Jeff sharing his experience because it's really not talked about. And I'm very grateful for you sharing your experience because it's really not talked about. How, in the experiencer world, I think that I'm attributing this to Jeff correctly, but he said something like, if an experiencer hasn't told you their story about trauma or sex, they haven't said the whole story, and it just seems to be, and why wouldn't it? If we're looking at if we're kind of rediscovering who we are as humans, but we're going to say, except for that, like, we're not like, it's everywhere except there, it's very strange, but it's, talk about stigma and talk about what is okay and what isn't okay. And I didn't grow up religious, but I have like a lot of the repression and stuff is intrinsic in me too, just because of how our culture was. And then it comes out in like weird, bizarre shadow ways, that it's a very weird subject. But I also have like, as you were telling that story, so much compassion for that kid who went through that, like having this amazing transcendent experience and having that reaction, like so earnest, this kid who's like, I shouldn't be doing this. First of all, like, this is bad that I'm having these feelings. And then it shut down and then internalizing the badness again. Oh, it's because I compared this that it got shut down. That's a lot for a kid to hold. Sometimes I think about like, what if this humanness that we're talking about, like rediscovering our humanness was something we could teach our kids?
Yeah, absolutely.
Remembering,
Thanks for saying that. That made me think of one other thing that I wanted to share, which was, so again, going back to this context of living in fear and constantly thinking that I was literally never going to live past the age of 18, I craved, like I would go to bed praying at night, like, if I may be so fortunate, like what would it be like to have a wife and child? Because I know I'm just not going to have it. And like, I was surrounded by like an amazing family life. And so I think it was natural that like these were the types of things I craved. And so I just completely took it for granted that this is never going to be afforded to me. And so, I hemmed and hawed over this for a long time. There was like several years of being like, Oh, well, and also like I wasn't dating at the time, but it was also like I wasn't dating at the time because there was all these like sexual hangups. And so long story short, I was beating myself up about a lot of this, and I had this experience one day, and I would say at the time that it was like God showing me a vision, but I now think it was me. So I'm saying this like prayer essentially of like, oh, like, yeah, like, may I have a um wife and family someday. And I got this feeling that was sort of, it wasn't like divine grace or like a pleasurable sort of like, oh, here's a vision of like what your ideal life is going to look like. It was sort of like, hey, but like calm down, like a reassuring shoulder, like touching you and being like, it's going to be okay. Like there's so much other stuff that is important in your life to be focused on. Like focus on that instead. Be a kid. Um, and you know, it was that download in addition to what felt like a super brief like click of an image in your mind's eye of what that family life would look like. I get emotional now talking about it. Um, and so now, so I completely forgot about this memory until very recently, where, I'm now a year into having a kid, have an amazing wife, amazing family life, sitting around our dinner table going like, oh, like this, what a miracle. And I think that that moment of being able to just have that experience, looking at how God has shown up in my life to provide this for me. And then I think in that moment, that whatever that snapshot was at the dinner table is what I sent back to myself in that moment. This aspect that, time doesn't work the way we think it does. I think of Eric Wargo's work, Time Loops. I had that ability. And so then like after having that thought and remembering the that inner child who was suffering at that time, I deliberately sat in that moment of being like, wow, I am blessed. And I sent that message back to myself. Like I prayed it back to me. And I now credit whatever that experience was back in the day to it was me talking to myself. It wasn't God, but like God as mediator or, whatever the fabric of the cosmos that affords those abilities to happen. Because I think that's how I would treat myself. Like, hey, bud, calm down. It's going to be okay. Um, but I think I needed it then, and I needed this experience now to confirm that. And I just feel so fortunate that, yeah, I was given that time.
That is extraordinary. I literally am covered with chills. Like my whole body is covered in chills because that is such a beautiful story. And I deeply believe that we send ourselves messages from our future selves. And the fact that you were able to have that experience and track it and remember it and see that loop closed and see that circle completed is so, so, so beautiful. I really love that. If I was more disciplined, and that would be a practice that I would do regularly, like sending, like, you're going to get through it, it's going to be okay, and sending to my future self, like, show me the way, because I do think that we touch these places in time. That's
Yeah.
extraordinary. I wonder, yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. Because I mean, like having been through that and experienced that now, even if I did not have those moments in the past that were like feeling like those moments, I don't feel the need to close the loop anymore. But I do believe, like you said, like sending messages back to myself or sending messages to my future self, I think is actually has become an important part of my practice. And I do that for other people too. I mean, like, I think that's just what prayer and intention is. And I respond so much to your honeycomb matrix narrative about we are afforded these opportunities and we don't realize the power of them. Like there is a sense of power and intention to prayer, and that's really all prayer is whether it be through thought forms or whatever abilities are given to us that allow these things to happen. We are, I think of, there's this really frustrating interview with Jim Lakatsky on the Weaponized podcast where, he has a Catholic background, and he was talking about, there's a lot of like scary stuff in this literature, but like if humans he was essentially alluding to this aspect of like, if people knew what I knew, like being as part of these like hidden programs, but also the idea of like, I think he was really speaking maybe more so to his Catholicism, but he's sort of saying like, if people really knew what they were capable of, we wouldn't have these fears. And I'm like, Jim, that's an incredibly frustrating thing to say without clarifying. But also, I completely agree with you. And it's like I've seen this show up in my own life. I've seen this show up in the lives of others. And these are important practices, and we need to show up in our lives with more intention and more joy, and afford ourselves, affording our inner child and our shadow selves that kind of tender loving care, for lack of a better word. But we can do it for other people too, and we do it for the whole world.
Mm.
The way the loving kindness prayer showed up in my life during COVID completely changed my spiritual practice. I think that was the period where everyone's home. I think this story's been true for a lot of people, but like being trapped at home, having a lot of downtime to start to do that self work and be like, okay, we're gonna unpack some of this stuff. I would just sit in my room and pray the loving kindness prayer and just sob for hours at a time. Hours is an exaggeration, but it felt like that. And I was just coming out of that period, I'm a completely changed individual. And I'm so much more ready now to show up in my life from this place of joy and this place of centeredness, knowing that like, yeah, the world can all be falling to shit and it appears that way, but like, that's not the case. We've always been in this, we've always been in this sense of like apocalypse and destruction, and the world is inevitably going to end any moment now. And there's been communities of people who designed prayers like this. This comes out of a monastic tradition of like, hey, like while the rest of the world is doing its thing and constantly running around like chickens with their head cut off, afraid of the way the world's going to play off, we're going to be over here doing our thing, loving the world back into being.
Mm.
And I'm like, that's what I'm here for.
Amazing. Yeah. That's what I'm here for too. I mean, that's the Bodhisattva vow, pretty much is like, that's why the whole thing, the evolution through suffering to evolution through joy, part of like evolution through suffering works. It does. It turns the wheel. And I needed it because to really fully accept that there's suffering and that this is what goes on this planet and this is what it looks like, and wars are happening. And it didn't make me less compassionate to have that understanding and bringing joy into it without trying to bypass around the suffering or bypass around the idea. It's all compassion. Like the reason to do it is because of the suffering. The reason to be joyful is because of the suffering, and it looks like the world is ending, and it feels like there has to be a counterpoint to that. So yeah, that's really amazing. Okay. Two things. One, I really hope that you will consider coming back. You don't have to decide in this moment, but I could truly talk to you. I feel like we could go deep into so many things, but I really would love to hear about your work with Marian literature. And I don't know anything about it. All I have is that as part of my journey, the goddess arrived and was very unexpected and very shocking and very different than contact with ETs or whatever that is, or NHI, or it did not feel located, far away in the sky. It feels like she is here coming up, like through the soles of my feet and rearranging things in a way that feels so different. And so I'm very curious about Marian apparitions, the lady. I don't know if I told you this, but I was at the cloisters in New York and I went to see the Marian statues. That's why I went, because I have such love for that. And I don't know anything about it, but I love her. And so I'm super, super curious about your work there.
Absolutely. Yeah, let's get into it. Some of my first exposure to the way the divine feminine has showed up and this lady figure has showed up in my own understanding of my religion was taking a biblical archaeology class in college. And so biblical archaeology focused in on like, what are the archaeological discoveries being made within the Middle East, and how is that informing our understanding of these biblical texts? And it was a hard class. This was like a entry level freshman class, and this teacher taught it like a 400 level, like, doctorate class. And it started with 18 people, and I was one of maybe five that sort of stuck through it. And I mean, I loved the class because I had a vested interest in it. But you could see that there was a lot of people that were like, I'm just, get in, get out. He exposed me to this idea that in early Israeli settlements that were, Israel, like the Empire of Israel, like 1000 BC, we can we know within the archaeology what are religious settlements of Israeli people, and within these homes we find divine feminine statues everywhere. So there's this contradiction within the literature here of the Jewish people are only supposed to have a divine masculine. They have their Yahweh God concept, and we have all of these prescriptions in the religion surrounding not making artifacts or depictions of this God. It was outlawed as part of their commandments. But what it seems like the Jewish people were doing was responding to the Canaanite culture of the era, having some sort of female counterpart. And so there was, within the folk religious belief, God having a wife. And we see this in the archaeology, but it is not at all discussed within our biblical texts. And, and there's reasons surrounding that. It could be the fact that we needed to make these commandments to outlaw this thing that was happening within the culture, or people were seeing that and there was still this hunger for the divine feminine. So like very clearly, there has always been a way that religious people were showing up for this aspect of needing the divine feminine in their lives that they felt was being set aside by the institutional power. I'm so fascinated with the Marian apparition literature and experiencer literature surrounding the lady, Black Madonna appearances, all these sorts of stories because of these types of narratives. It's been a history that's been set aside that is just absolutely captivating and should upend our perspectives of what our institutional religion is showing us and telling us. So the way it's showing up in my work is I specifically come back to the Marian apparition literature as something that, like, one, it's not only important to me for my my religious history, but also the way it's showing up within the experiential literature of Chris Bledsoe's lady being this like Hathor figure who's this divine feminine within the Egyptian culture, the white buffalo calf woman within Lakota culture. There's all of these narratives of this figure showing up, and so like clearly we see in Diana Pasulka's research that there's people within government who seem to be interested in this figure. I love Valet and Keel's theories surrounding that this figure might be some sort of control mechanism for like changing and shaping human consciousness, getting us to think in different ways, not only about our culture and our politics of our own eras, but also how can we shape the development of the religion? How can we shape the development of consciousness? And so then it becomes really important. What is this figure saying? And so I've tied that into my own artwork coming from, I have a lot of like personal investment in it. The rose petal narrative that I'm developing. So within some of the work I'm doing for my graduate school, working towards my thesis, is I'm transposing images of Cold War themes onto rose petals. And what this comes from is within the 20th century, at Marian apparition sites, there are claims of rose petals falling from the sky. We see this at Fatima, where it's alternatively called angel hair, and people use that term for some of its ufological elements that show up in other ufological cases. But in the primary source testimony, you have a lot more people who refer to it as flower petals, not necessarily roses. They say it as a white blob of light that would descend from the sky associated with these apparitions that would disappear before touching the crowds. So that's Fatima. And that's a very widely known, incredibly popular, Vatican approved apparition, meaning like the Vatican has put a stamp of approval on it saying like, we have enough witness testimony to confirm that this was something that we are putting a cult of beliefs surrounding. In Lipa, which is a city in the Philippines, in 1948, there was a Marian apparition there at I think it was a Carmelite monastery, where associated with that apparition, rose petals also fell. These rose petals fell everywhere. There was no rose bushes or anything nearby that would allow this to have blown in from somewhere else. So these would happen outside in their gardens, but this would also happen in interiors, and there would be piles and piles. If somebody took a laundry hamper and dumped it out, is sort of what we see in the testimony. So occasionally, these rose petals would have miraculous images on them. So there's this tradition within art history and religious art history called acheiropoieta, which just literally means, from the Greek, meaning made without hand. And so when we think of miraculous images that are made by God, we think of things like the Shroud of Turin, which is the burial cloth of Jesus that's believed to be that has this image superimposed on his body. If you believe the narrative, it would say that at the moment that Jesus incarnate or resurrected, there was a bright flash of light that was what created this imprint, some sort of UV-esque imprint on this burial cloth. So that's some of the logic surrounding how this image was formed. There's a lot of skeptical conflict over whether or not this was a hoax or not, but there's a lot of, I would encourage people to look into some of the new data that's coming out surrounding this, because I want to say in the 90s, maybe, it was generally regarded to have been shown to be a medieval era hoax. But I think a lot of that science has not borne out over time as new methods have been devised. And so the question is now open again. And it's kind of exciting to think that, hey, the mystery is back. I'm not saying conclusively that this is legit, but it's fun that the science that was there previously is now open-ended. But okay, so then we get other famous acheiropoieta images, like the Our Lady of Guadalupe image, also associated with the Marian apparition. And I just briefly, if you're willing, that's your cover art for the show is am I wrong? Is that comes from that image?
The Virgin of Guadalupe, yeah, and it is my direct my way of making note of the fact that both ETs and the goddess showed up. The divine feminine and NHI, because there's a UFO above her, her right shoulder, and I think it's so weird. I just think it's so strange and improbable. So, but yeah, and where I grew up in the Southwest. This isn't my tradition. It's not my lineage, but I was surrounded by these images as a kid. It's part of it's one way that I see her. And so yes, yeah, it's weird, but I actually painted that on the back of a denim jacket and then manipulated it for my podcast tile, because it talks about what we're talking about. Weird. It's weird.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
why do ETs and the divine feminine show up? And now I'm integrating it more, but it still is very fun for me and cool and strange.
Absolutely. And I mean, when you look at that Fatima literature up close, the church does not want to talk about the fact that this was a silver disc in the sky that was associated with the miracle of the sun. Different people have different eyewitness testimony surrounding that. They say, the clouds dissolved and the sun dulled in appearance and shined with various, technicolor swirls, and Dance in the Sky came down to the crowd. Everybody was warmed. It had rained just before, and so the crowds were suddenly dry. But you look at other testimony, and it was this was a silver disc in the sky that placed itself in front of the sun, to the point where you also have eyewitness testimony from farmers miles away from the actual site where the apparitions were occurring, who were oh yeah, we saw this thing fly across the sky to that site, among the clouds, literally straight out of the movie Nope. So no one in the church or any sort of institutional power wants to talk about the fact that this was something that was seen at this event, but it's there in the testimony. And if you tell that to my Catholic mom, her head's gonna pop off. It's there to the point where it's we just have to note that and say that that's weird and continue with the fact that this was like sanctioned by the church and is now, it's not church doctrine. The church is not asking people to say like, you have to believe in this, but it's there saying like, we've looked into it enough and given enough credence that we think that this is important. And that's true of all Marian apparitions, I should say that. Okay, so back to Lipa. So these rose petals that would fall at the convent had miraculous images on them. Here's the problem: is it's easy to hoax that process. You can put a image on a rose petal, and I've done it for this project. And I also have, as part of my family has this heirloom item that is passed down from the family, a miraculous rose petal alleged to come from Slovakia. I'd say my great aunt apparently was given it by a parish priest, and it's just been passed down from the family. And I'll send you a picture. You can include it in the show notes if you want. But it's a image of a cross with like a bed of flowers next to it, and you can see it on both sides. It's like clear as day. And my open-ended question, hearing about the story, that apparently this image was impressed on these rose petals by virtue of the priest praying over them for the congregation, and then he distributed them. Every single person had wildly different images on them. Some had a face of Jesus. This is the story that I have. So I have no way of confirming this. I have no way of tracing the provenance of the story. But knowing that this has been like this heirloom item that's been passed down in our family for generations, probably potentially tracing back to the 1890s, maybe in the 1930s is the way we tell the story. I want that to be true. I think that's an amazing story. And looking at the Lipa apparition, very clearly we have in the witness testimony. I mean, these rose petal showers continued for years and years and years. This was not relegated to one event, and there would be massive crowds that would see them. And so people were leaving these apparition sites with hundreds of rose petals, some of which had images, and then those rose petals can then travel the world and testify to the fact that something miraculous happened at this location. I tie that into this notion that these are modern day relics. These are relics of the past, used to be the bones of saints. And, you only have one body. So you have to break up bones and transfer them around if you want to have some sort of devotion to a cult of a saint. But in the modern day, especially in the case of these rose petals, there's millions of them, allegedly, and they can travel the world. They're portable. You can pop them in your pocket, and they testify that something miraculous happened. And then there's sort of a photographic process that got to making these. There's a lot of researchers who are looking at this notion that in the modern day, technology has become a new way of how we access the divine. So we think about going on the internet and we hear, I no longer have to travel the world to go to a shrine site or an apparition site to encounter the Virgin Mary. I can do it from my home. I can jump on the internet, look at and see on social media people testifying to the fact that I went to Lourdes and had a healing. How great is our God? And those sorts of narratives produce belief in people. I no longer have to go to a site to experience these things. And so there's these really interesting studies that are coming out of this. Jill Krebs and Joe Laycock are two religious scholars who are looking at this, who say that it's interesting to note that Marian belief and Marian apparition sites, modern Marian apparition sites, occur in areas of greater internet and technological access than they do in Catholic populations. So that would say something about the fact that like technology is a mediating factor for accessing the divine. It's just a weird, interesting note that we have to take note of. And there's a million reasons for why that could be. Where this gets really fascinating is that technology is now outpacing the church. The church, back in 1917, when the Fatima apparition happened, it was only known within Portugal for probably a period of 20, 30 years. When suddenly a lot of pilgrims took this narrative over to the United States and really made it like a global phenomenon. And so the church had a lot of ability to control the narrative. The two other children, Jacinto, and I forget the other gentleman's name, the children who passed away of the Spanish flu shortly after the apparition, and Sister Lucia, who's on the way to becoming a saint now, was the only surviving seer of the Fatima event. The church invited her to become a nun and then they cloistered her from the world, and they were able to essentially control her narrative. I don't like, you don't want to assume that that's the case, but like that's what happened. And so you can just look at the narrative and say, um, this woman wasn't able to share her story as it appeared to her because it had to be mediated by a priest. She had a confessor who she would tell her story to. And then the church was always looking over her shoulder, determining what was permissible. And that's where we have scandal coming out of surrounding the fact that she apparently had several secrets that had to do with 20th century prophecy. Russia was listed as this great evil in the world. We also have prophecies surrounding the assassination of a pope and like the falling apart of the priesthood. In the 1980s, we have the assassination attempt of John Paul II. And so there's people who say like, okay, that was the end of this one prophecy and there's no more after this. But then you have a lot of people who are like, clearly the church is sitting on more to this story than has ever come out. And this is causing a flashpoint now because of the Ukraine-Russia conflict. And there's people within the church who apparently are privy or, have more information that's never leaked to the public surrounding the fact that like Ukraine might have something more to do with these end time prophecies than we're let on, that were apparently given back to Sister Lucia all the way back in 1917. So for like some strain of conservative Catholic culture who like deeply believe in these events, they're like, this event happened over 100 years ago, but like it's having critically important ramifications today. And so, that's absolutely fascinating. And I invite more people to look into these narratives because like this is a very real strain that's happening right now that's sort of like bubbling under the surface of not just Catholic culture, but our current foreign policy has implications. There's people in Congress who believe these narratives who are like deciding on Ukraine getting funding. So like, this aspect of Mary showing up in times of struggle and preaching to the world very specific messages that are having profound ramifications, not just for individuals, but also seemingly like quietly guiding the movements of like nation states. It's like we should be talking about this and paying attention to this more. And, and then so broadening it out as to say, within the experience of literature of looking at Chris Bledsoe's Hathor story and the lady pops up everywhere. The more and more you look into it, it's like, who is this figure? What are her motivations? Why is she showing up in people's lives? I think we need to be paying more attention to this. And some of what my artwork is being born out of is trying to draw more attention to this narrative. And okay, so then going back to this idea of like photography as relic, when I'm creating these images and superimposing them on rose petals, I'm specifically sourcing from Cold War themes, looking at this fact that Mary seemed very invested in the way that the Cold War was going to play out. And there's a whole weird archive of history surrounding that. Like the CIA was secretly funding priests to go to South American countries to preach this Fatima message about, Russia needing to be converted to Catholicism or else we were going to have this like nuclear war. And when the Pope found out about this, he was like, shut it down immediately because like we do not want to get involved in the scandal of, the CIA giving our priesthood money. People need to hear that story. I don't think that's like talked about. And so I'm also I'm using AI in certain aspects of the generation of these images because I'm relating it to this idea of acheiropoieta. The AI art discourse is in this place right now where, I got really invested in it and interested in it because when you create an AI image, there's this question of who is the creator on the other side. We're speculating about AI having this ability in the near future to become its own like conscious entity. Will it be a savior of humankind or will it be our destruction? We have a million narratives surrounding that. I don't land on one side or the other at the moment. But I do think it's fascinating that when we're interacting with these technologies, it could be our own undoing or it could be a savior. And there was this question for me of when I make an AI image, who is the thing on the other side? And when we look at acheiropoieta, that's the same question. Who made the Shroud of Turin image? Who made the Our Lady of Guadalupe image? So having that play when I'm superimposing some of these AI generated images, not all the time, but in some cases, I'm like altering them with AI. I'm hoping to create these modern relics that have been touched by some sense of divinity, and we can speculate about what that NHI is, but it is a non-human intelligence. And, and I understand that this is incredibly heated territory. People are violently opposed to AI art, and as they should be. I mean, there's very, very legitimate ethical issues. If you're not aware, a lot of this imagery that allows AI art to exist comes from the fact that it was scraped from the internet as copywritten sources. There are very real lives of people who are affected by this. And I hope to draw some attention to that by the fact that this is controversial. Marian apparitions are controversial. These NHI meddling in our lives, we don't know their motivations. We don't. I'm asking you to look at the designers of these programs and speculate about like, why is it they did this? What ultimately may come down to capital. There's people who speculate about like the fact that this is going to be at the end of creative labor as we know it, because suddenly computers are going to eat up all of our desire to make art and passion. We were talking about archons earlier. It's like, there you go. This seems like a terrible technology, but at the same time, like it's making amazing things. If I was a child and had access to AI art, I think it would inspire things in me that I'd never experienced before because it's so easy to use. It allows me to be creative and have fun in ways that I may not have been before. And like, I think it's awesome that it does exist, but we do need to like put a more critical eye on it and find more ethical ways of using this technology. There's a lot there.
There's a lot there, and I am very much here for it. It's really amazing. I feel like if my life had taken a different turn, I would be a therapist, or I would have been a therapist or an academic, because I love, like, I am delighted by like these ideas and the brilliance of bringing these things together and bringing together Marian apparitions and AI. And rose petals is, who does that? You do. It's amazing. Like, it's really, and there's something, there's definitely something to all of this. All the things that we talk about in the experiencer world that swirl around together are all of the things that you've brought forward. So it's really, really fascinating. I don't know anything about like the history of Marian apparitions and things like that. And just the little glimpse you've given me is so enticing. So I don't know. I feel like I could talk to you for a really long time. And I would like to talk to you more about this. Yeah. But we're getting near our time where we both have kind of hard stops, but it's completely fascinating. Is there anything that we didn't touch on that you would like to touch on before we close? I know there's so much.
Not in 5 minutes. No.
Okay.
I would love to come back on because I would love to pick up the conversation with just like arts practices in general and like responding to your evolution of joy. There's evolution of suffering, evolution to joy, response of saying like the way to get to that point is through creativity and through art and working with this stuff through our hands and through our passions. That's something this conversation I really love to continue with. And I know you have an arts practice. I know that's your background, and I want to hear more about your arts practice.
Yeah. I would love that. I really would. Cause that's the thing is we've been talking for, I don't know, almost 2 hours and have just scratched the surface. I feel like there's so much to talk about. So yes, I hope that you will come back. And do you feel okay about the conversation and how it went?
Absolutely. Yeah. No.
Yeah? Do you feel like you spilled any beans that you're nervous about spilling or?
No, not at all.
Good. Okay.
Yeah. And thank you. I mean, it was an absolute joy to dialogue with you, and genuinely I look forward to doing it again. This was fun.
Yeah, absolutely. Me too. Thank you again so much to Mark Burchick and to Morgan Jenks for our musical soundscapes. If you would like to learn more about Mark's work, check the show notes. Please consider becoming a patron by visiting patreon.com/Robin Lassiter. And to find out more about my upcoming group offering, The Bridge Collective, or to book a one-on-one session with me, please visit honeyheart.org.